When Donald Trump began his quiet campaign to silence Barack Obama, it wasn't just another political move, it was rooted in deep frustration. For years, Trump had measured himself against his predecessor, aware that the comparisons weren't flattering. Obama's speeches were replayed long after he left office, and his popularity remained steady even as Trump's approval numbers dipped. That presence gnawed at him, and he convinced himself that the solution was simple: if Obama could be sidelined, his own voice would dominate again. Trump leaned into his usual methods. Allies were encouraged to dismiss Obama's opinions as outdated, pundits were pushed to spin narratives portraying him as irrelevant, and pressure quietly spread across media circles to reduce coverage of his appearances. To Trump, it was a test of dominance, his belief that the sheer force of his personality could overwhelm a figure who no longer held political office. But what Trump underestimated was that silencing Obama would only make his voice echo louder. Obama, in contrast, didn't engage in loud counterattacks. He was measured, deliberate, and almost surgical in how he chose to speak. When whispers grew that Trump was actively trying to marginalize him, Obama stepped into the public eye with a speech that seemed calm on the surface but struck like a lightning bolt beneath the words. Addressing an auditorium full of young people, community organizers, and everyday citizens, he spoke not about himself, but about what it means when leaders try to suppress opposing voices. When leaders spend their energy trying to silence others, he said, his tone steady and unhurried, it's not because they are strong. It's because they're afraid. Afraid of losing control, afraid of being challenged, afraid of the truth being louder than their noise. The room fell into complete silence as his words sank in. He didn't even mention Trump's name, yet no one doubted who he was talking about. The effect was immediate. News outlets picked up the clip, commentators dissected every line, and social media turned it into a trending storm. Trump's efforts to bury Obama's voice had produced the exact opposite outcome. Obama's words were suddenly everywhere. By attempting to silence him, Trump had amplified him. What was meant to shrink his influence instead magnified it tenfold. Across the country, people found themselves revisiting the differences between the two men. Trump's fiery, combative style was familiar to them, but Obama's calm dismantling of the situation revealed a contrast that was hard to ignore. It wasn't the drama of politics that caught the nation's attention, it was the composure. Obama didn't need to raise his voice, he simply spoke truths that resonated in a way that drowned out Trump's noise without ever engaging in it directly. For Trump, it became a maddening cycle. The harder he tried to minimize Obama, the more attention Obama gained. Each new insult or attempt to diminish his relevance only pushed more people to revisit what Obama had said. Clips of the speech played side by side with Trump's rebuttals, and the contrast was impossible to miss. On one side, a president who sought to silence. On the other, a former president who turned that attempt into an example of weakness. Behind closed doors, Trump's aides struggled to contain the fallout. They had set out to weaken Obama's reach, but instead, they had reignited it. Even conservative voices were forced to admit that Trump had mishandled the situation, turning a small moment into a national conversation. Obama had not just survived the silencing attempt, he had risen above it, reminding the country why his words carried weight long after his presidency. The irony of it all was not lost on the public. Trump's attempt to erase Obama from the conversation ended up spotlighting him more than ever before. By trying to silence him, Trump gave him a platform larger than the one he already had. And in doing so, he confirmed the very fear Obama had spoken about, that true strength doesn't come from silencing others, but from allowing ideas to stand and be tested. Barack Obama had always understood the power of words. They were never just sentences strung together, they were instruments of influence, carefully measured, carrying weight even in their simplicity. When Donald Trump tried to sideline him, the reaction wasn't explosive or loud. Obama knew that volume wasn't necessary. What mattered was clarity. And when he finally spoke, it was his calmness that exposed Trump's real weakness. At a community event filled with students and local leaders, Obama took the stage with the kind of quiet confidence that had defined his presidency. He didn't storm into the moment, and he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he leaned into his natural rhythm, measured and deliberate, as if he was speaking directly to each person in the room. Without naming Trump outright, he addressed the larger idea of what it means when leaders attempt to silence opposing voices. "There's a reason some leaders want a quiet dissent," he said softly, his hands moving gently as if guiding the crowd's attention. "It's not because they're strong. It's because they're afraid. Afraid of losing control, afraid of being held accountable, afraid that the truth will echo louder than their own noise." The crowd was still, their focus locked on him. It wasn't a fiery speech, yet it struck with more force than shouting ever could. Obama's composure was disarming, because it revealed something that Trump had tried to hide, that attempts to silence others are rooted in fear, not strength. While Trump projected bravado in his public persona, Obama's words painted that bravado as a mask, a fragile defense against insecurity. The moment traveled quickly. Clips of Obama's remarks spread online within minutes, and major news outlets replayed the scene again and again. What Trump had wanted to avoid Obama capturing the public's imagination was now happening on a scale far larger than he anticipated. People weren't just listening to what Obama said, they were internalizing it. The simplicity of his phrasing made the message impossible to ignore. Trump, watching from afar, reacted the way he always did, through bursts of anger on social media and dismissive comments in interviews. He called Obama irrelevant and accused him of seeking attention. But those responses only deepened the contrast. On one side was a man calmly dissecting the meaning of leadership. On the other, a man visibly rattled, scrambling to shout down a message that had already landed with the public. Even critics of Obama had to admit that his tone carried weight. It wasn't just that he spoke, it was how he spoke. By keeping his delivery calm, he denied Trump the dramatic conflict he thrived on. He forced the focus back onto substance, onto the idea that true leadership could be measured by how one responds to dissent. The more Trump lashed out, the clearer the picture became. Obama had revealed the cracks in the armor. Communities across the country began to discuss the deeper meaning of Obama's remarks. Teachers played the clip in classrooms, activists referenced it in rallies, and commentators noted how his calmness exposed Trump's insecurities without needing to mention his name. The strength of the reply wasn't in its aggression, but in its restraint. It showed that composure itself could be more devastating than anger. For Trump, who prided himself on dominating headlines, the shift was infuriating. The story wasn't about him silencing his rival, it was about his rival calmly showing the nation that his silencing attempt came from a place of fear. What was supposed to be a moment of control turned into a revelation of weakness. The harder Trump pushed, the more he seemed to prove Obama's point. The resonance of the moment lasted well beyond the speech itself. People began to compare the two figures not just in terms of policy or legacy, but in how they carried themselves under pressure. Obama's calmness highlighted Trump's volatility. His clarity highlighted Trump's confusion. And his restraint highlighted Trump's desperation. What was meant to be a silencing act became a mirror, reflecting Trump's fear back at him for all of America to see. Obama never needed to outshout Trump, he simply needed to expose the truth behind his actions. By framing the attempt at silencing his fear, he shifted the narrative completely. Instead of appearing strong, Trump now appeared insecure. Instead of controlling the stage, he was scrambling to reclaim it. And that shift in perception was more powerful than any direct attack could have been. When Barack Obama's words began circulating across television screens, radio broadcasts, and countless online platforms, it became clear that his response had touched a nerve far beyond the walls of that community gathering. Ordinary Americans, tired of endless political noise, found themselves pausing to listen. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. In a time where politics had become defined by shouting matches, his calm voice cut through like a steady note in the middle of chaos. The more Donald Trump tried to shout him down, the more people leaned into Obama's message. Across the country, conversations began shifting. In living rooms, cafes, college campuses, and workplaces, people replayed the clip, pointing to the contrast between the two men. Obama had said that leaders who attempt to silence others act out of fear, not strength. That single observation stuck with millions, resonating in ways that Trump's fiery rants could not. Parents explained the moment to their children as an example of standing tall without shouting. Educators used it as a lesson in communication, showing how calmness often holds more influence than anger. The public's reaction was not accidental. For years, they had grown accustomed to Trump's style, aggressive, combative, and often dismissive of critics. It was entertaining to some, exhausting to others, but always loud. Obama's approach provided the opposite. He was deliberate, focused, and spoke in a way that gave people something to reflect on long after the cameras turned off. The contrast made his words stand out even more, and the silence after his sentences carried as much weight as the sentences themselves. Trump, watching the surge of attention Obama was receiving, tried to counteract it with his usual tactics. He sent out strings of social media posts, mocking Obama and belittling his relevance. He lashed out in interviews, suggesting that people were only listening to Obama out of misplaced nostalgia. But each attack only gave more life to the story. Every insult was replayed side by side with Obama's calm remarks, and the comparison was striking. Trump looked increasingly desperate, while Obama appeared composed and unwavering. What struck many Americans most was the authenticity of Obama's message. He wasn't trying to insert himself into every news cycle, nor was he attempting to dominate through sheer volume. Instead, he highlighted a principle that resonated with the country's democratic values, that silencing voices is a sign of fear, and real strength comes from allowing dialogue, even when it is uncomfortable. This clarity turned his words into more than just commentary, it turned them into a moral lesson that people could hold on to. Communities began rallying around the idea. Activists quoted Obama's line in speeches, faith leaders referenced it in sermons, and even political analysts admitted that it struck at the core of what Americans were witnessing. In a landscape filled with noise, Obama's calm voice became the one that cut through and lingered. For many, it was a reminder of the kind of leadership they missed, and it made Trump's attempts at dominance feel hollow in comparison. The effect rippled into public opinion. Polls and surveys at the time revealed a growing divide. While Trump's supporters remained loyal, a significant number of Americans admitted that Obama's words captured how they felt. They were tired of the shouting, tired of the constant battles for attention, and eager for something steady. Obama had tapped into that exhaustion, giving people language to express what they already sensed, that constant noise was not leadership, and that silencing critics was not strength. Meanwhile, Trump's inner circle realized that his aggressive responses were only reinforcing Obama's point. Advisors urged him to change tactics, to downplay the remarks instead of attacking them. But Trump was never one to back down from confrontation, and his refusal to shift strategy meant the story remained alive longer than it might have otherwise. Every time he lashed out, he confirmed the very fear that Obama had described. For everyday Americans, the episode became a moment of clarity. They didn't need to choose sides to see the difference. On one hand was a leader who tried to silence opposition through force and insults. On the other was a leader who dismantled that attempt with composure, exposing insecurity without ever needing to name his rival. That difference spoke louder than any debate stage or press conference could have. Obama's words reminded the nation of something deeper. That influence doesn't come from drowning others out but from offering ideas that resonate beyond the moment. His reply gave people a sense of grounding, something to measure against the endless wave of political spectacle. And as his words continued to spread, they took on a life of their own, becoming more than a rebuttal to Trump. They became a message about leadership itself, a message that the public embraced in a way Trump could never have anticipated. The clash between Donald Trump and Barack Obama over the attempt to silence him ended up revealing something far bigger than a political rivalry. It exposed a truth that had been quietly waiting beneath the surface. Real power doesn't come from shouting the loudest, dominating headlines, or drowning out opposing voices. It comes from ideas that endure, from words that continue to resonate even when the speaker is no longer in office. And in this case, Obama's message proved that point in a way Trump never intended. When Trump tried to sideline him, the expectation was that Obama would fade into the background, his influence reduced to occasional commentary. But instead, the opposite happened. Obama's calm reply didn't just answer Trump, it illuminated the very weakness in Trump's approach. By framing the act of silencing as fear, Obama placed a mirror in front of the nation, showing that attempts to dominate through suppression only highlight insecurity. The more Trump fought to control the stage, the more people noticed that Obama didn't need the stage at all, his ideas carried themselves. The lasting impact of Obama's response was evident in the way it traveled beyond politics. Students quoted him in their essays, leaders referenced him in speeches, and communities invoked his words in conversations about freedom and responsibility. It wasn't just that he had countered Trump, it was that he had articulated something universal. Strength is not the absence of opposition, but the willingness to let opposition exist. That idea began to circulate in civic discussions, classrooms, and public debates long after the initial moment had passed. Trump, meanwhile, continued to rely on volume. His rants and dismissals were designed to overwhelm, but over time, they began to feel repetitive. The public had seen the pattern too many times before, an insult here, a dismissive wave there, a new attempt to discredit critics. What Obama showed in contrast was that influence doesn't fade when you leave office if your words carry principles people can believe in. And because his reply spoke to something bigger than just himself or Trump, it stuck. The irony was sharp. Trump had always believed that control came from silencing or dominating others, but this episode showed that control can slip away even in the middle of a shouting match. Obama didn't interrupt him, didn't insult him, and didn't attempt to compete in the same way. Instead, he delivered a message so resonant that it continued to live on without his presence. People repeated it, internalized it, and carried it forward, which made it stronger than anything Trump tried to drown out. In neighborhoods across the country, the message sparked conversations about leadership itself. Parents used it as a lesson for their children, explaining that true strength doesn't come from pushing others down but from standing steady when challenged. Community leaders pointed to it as an example of moral clarity. Even those who didn't always agree with Obama admitted that his words carried weight because they cut past partisanship and spoke to something deeply human. For Trump, the problem was that every attempt to push back only emphasized the divide between their styles. He thrived on quick bursts of attention, but Obama's reply thrived on longevity. Weeks after the moment, people were still quoting Obama, while Trump's insults had already faded into the endless cycle of news. That was the heart of the difference. Noise is temporary, but resonance lasts. The more people reflected on the exchange, the clearer it became that Obama's influence didn't depend on holding office. It depended on the strength of his ideas, and that was something Trump could never silence. By trying to minimize him, Trump inadvertently gave him a larger platform. By trying to erase him, Trump etched him even deeper into the conversation. The attempt to control the narrative ended up losing control of it altogether. What emerged from this clash was not just a lesson in political rivalry but in leadership itself. Obama's calm reply reminded the nation that history doesn't remember the loudest voices, it remembers the ones that speak truths that cannot be ignored. Trump had tried to shout over him, but the echo of Obama's words carried farther, lasting longer, and striking deeper. It was proof that real power is not about who can silence the other, but about whose message survives the silence. As the dust settled from the confrontation between Donald Trump and Barack Obama, the real outcome became clearer. It was never simply about one man trying to silence another. It was about what the episode revealed to the American public. Trump had attempted to flex his influence, to push Obama out of the national conversation through noise, dismissal, and pressure. Yet his actions backfired spectacularly. Rather than shrinking Obama's presence, they magnified it. Rather than erasing his words, they etched them more deeply into the minds of millions. Obama's calm, deliberate reply became the defining moment. He didn't have to shout, insult, or match Trump's aggression. Instead, he framed the very act of silencing as an admission of fear. That single idea flipped the entire narrative on its head. Suddenly, Trump's attempts at control didn't look like power, they looked like weakness. His anger and outbursts didn't show dominance, they revealed insecurity. In contrast, Obama's restraint carried authority. His composure carried weight. And his words traveled far beyond the event where he first spoke them. For the public, the incident became a reminder of what true leadership looks like. It wasn't about the spectacle or the volume. It wasn't about monopolizing attention or drowning out criticism. Real leadership was about offering a message that connected with people on a deeper level, one that could withstand the noise and endure long after the moment had passed. Obama's response provided exactly that. He didn't just counter Trump, he exposed the fragility of a style built only on shouting. Trump, of course, continued to fight back, but with diminishing returns. Each new attempt to discredit Obama only reinforced the truth of Obama's words. Every insult became evidence of the very fear that Obama had spoken about. It was a cycle Trump could not escape, because the more he tried to prove otherwise, the more he confirmed the point. In the end, what stood out was not the attempt to silence but the power of the reply. Obama reminded the nation that influence doesn't depend on holding office or commanding headlines every day. It depends on the ability to speak truths that people remember, truths that spread on their own, carried by those who hear them. Trump had tried to control the narrative, but Obama's words escaped that control, taking root in conversations across the country. The episode revealed a lasting lesson, that power built on fear is fragile, but power built on ideas is enduring. Trump's noise was loud, but temporary. Obama's calm was quiet, but lasting. And in that contrast, America saw a reflection of the kind of leadership it longed for: steady, thoughtful, and unafraid of opposition. What was meant to silence became an amplification. What was meant to weaken became a reminder of strength. And what was meant to erase became, instead,